يا راغبا في كل علم نافع.
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Continuing with the Islamic Creed level 2 and with the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His names and attributes. The Tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of Al-Asma' wa Sifat. As we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one when it comes to His Rububiyyah, His Lordship. When it comes to His Uluhiyyah, He's the only one worthy of worship. And He subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one with His names and attributes. And there are names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, to believe in them, to understand what the meanings of them, and to protect ourselves from any deviations or distortion of the matter of belief as a result of those who deviated from the true belief of the people of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, from these deviant sects that came to the Ummah splitted as a result of the falsehood that they were upon in this subject of Al-Asma' wa Sifat. We'll talk about that inshallah ta'ala. But first, what is the meaning of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His Asma' and His Sifat, in the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What that means is to have the belief in the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and to believe in the meanings of them and the rulings of it upon a way that fits the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, without distorting the meaning of it, without denying it, without talking about how these names and attributes are, and without making any resemblance or similarities to the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or to the attributes of the human beings and the like of this. This is how the people of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they define the matter, and they define it in such a way because some of those who deviated away from the true path, from the way of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they would distort, they would deny, they would make ta'weel, explaining things not according to what things are, and with talking about how things are or making some form of resemblance. All of that is forbidden, all of that is haram, because it's a wahy, revelation from Allah, and we should believe in the revelation of Allah the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed it. So therefore, the way of the people of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah when it comes to affirming something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala affirmed about Himself in the Quran or in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, with these conditions that we heard. And when it comes to negating, they negate anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala negate about Himself from in the Quran, in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, while believing in the opposite perfection of it. And this will come in details inshallah ta'ala. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deny from Him subhanahu wa ta'ala that He commit any wrongdoing or injustice, that means we deny, we negate what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala negated upon Himself, while affirming the opposite of it, that He's the most just subhanahu wa ta'ala as a result of that. And it will come inshallah ta'ala. A third category, which is the things that never been mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, never negated, never been affirmed. And this is something that we have to be careful with. Some people, they initiate certain terminologies that it's not in the Quran, not in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and it's a matter of unseen. Like they would talk about al-jism, wal-hayyiz, wal-jiha, body parts, as some of the deviants, they claim that the people of Ahlul Sunnah, they say. They don't say these things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not mention these words in the Quran or in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the direction, the position. So terminologies, words that can lead to other matters and can lead the person astray. And it's not mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So the people of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they don't use these words because it's a matter of unseen. And the only way for us to know the unseen is through the revelation from Allah, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And also they don't say that since therefore when it comes to the unseen. They don't say since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attributed for himself hands, therefore then they would say things that is not according to the Quran and the Sunnah. Of course not. We only believe in what's in the Quran, what's in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. We don't add anything to what is mentioned in the Wahy revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if someone would say, Allah knows best, we do not talk about these things, we don't know whether this is true or not because there's no evidence of it in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The meaning of that is that when they seek details, if it's something that refers to falsehood, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is away from any form of deficiency or weakness or falsehood that they would attribute to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if someone would claim goodness and something that is upon the correct meaning of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about himself in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, then the people of knowledge would accept that. So this is basically we have to follow and never to contradict ourselves, following to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and what the early generations of Islam were upon. And the verse in the Quran that talks about the subject very clearly, that becomes a criteria to protect oneself from any contradiction, is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about himself, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. Nothing is the like of Allah, and He's the all-hearer, the all-seer. So the verse clearly denies, negates any similarities, any resemblance between the Creator and the creation. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Nothing is the like of Him. And at the same time to confirm and to affirm that He is the all-hearer, the all-seer. Human beings, they hear and they see. But لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ means nothing is the like of Allah. So that breaks all kinds of evil and deviant beliefs that people would adopt. Why? Because if they say no similarities, so they would alter some of the attributes of Allah or deny it, then how can they alter the attribute of Allah of as-sam' or al-basar? He's the all-hearer, the all-seer. So if this is the case, and the human beings are here and they see, but nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this ayah is basically the criteria in which for the people of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they deny any similarities, the liking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, while affirming the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the way that befits His Majesty subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we talk about the evidences in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, there are so many. One of which, for example, قَدْ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ قَوْلَ الَّتِي تُجَادِلُكَ فِي زَوْجِهَا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala heard the statement of the woman that came complaining about her husband. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, Alhamdulillah alladhi wasi'a sam'uhu al-aswat, that praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that His hearing encompasses all voices and all things. Why? Because this woman came to the Prophet ﷺ speaking to him, and Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, and I'm on the other side of the house, I'm not able to even hear what she's saying. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed Quran with regards to what she said to the Prophet ﷺ. Therefore, never to bring resemblance or draw parables between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His creation, because nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why that when anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attributed to Himself from the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is all perfect attributes. There's no deficiency in it, no weakness in it whatsoever. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is perfectly praised. And therefore, it's all perfect attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala denied from Himself, then these are weaknesses that opposes the perfect belief in the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the first part of what we just said now is that when something Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala affirms for Himself, no one is to say this is a negative or this is an attribute of weakness. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He's the most merciful, this is a perfect attribute of Allah. So if someone says mercy means weakness in the heart, a person feels bad for something, that's to you as a human being. But for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is a perfect attribute. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not weak. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never to attribute to Him any weakness and deficiency. So if He attributed to Himself a certain attribute, this is a perfect attribute that fits perfectly the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the most exalted, subhanahu wa ta'ala beyond what we can comprehend. So this is basically what needs for the person to be upon, and as a result of that we'll continue inshallah ta'ala with more of these matters and the concepts of the names and attributes of Allah that makes the person among the people of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
يا راغبا في كل علم نافع
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.